The Wyoming sun lingered low, spilling amber light across miles of swaying grass that whispered like the ocean. Heat from the long day softened into a slow, golden hush. Sage carried its clean scent on a breeze that teased the ends of Clara Whitlow's braid as she latched the final gate. Her gloves were stiff with dust, her shirt clung to the salt of work, yet she moved with an easy rhythm born of years alone on this plain. The herd grazed quiet in the fading glow, shadows stretching long until they were almost part of the night. She tipped her hat back, brushing a sleeve across her brow. Over the far meadow a small flame flickered, someone else's fire, steady and unhurried. Clara paused, the way she always did when she saw another soul against all that empty horizon. A solitary figure sat near the blaze, back straight, hands working at something she couldn't see. Not a ranch hand she knew, not one of the rail workers. Just a man who belonged to the evening as naturally as the coyotes calling in the distant canyons. The lantern on her porch glimmered faintly as she walked the worn path home. The boards of the old house creaked with a familiar welcome, carrying the memory of her father's boots and her mother's soft singing, both long gone now. She set her gloves on the rail and leaned a moment against the post. Out here, quiet wasn't absence, it was company. The rustle of grass, the far-off trickle of creek water, the low murmur of wind through pine, these were neighbors who never left. A hoofbeat disturbed the hush. Clara turned as a rider emerged from the dark, a courier's pouch slung across his chest. His horse's breath smoked in the cooling air. He tipped his hat and offered a sealed envelope, its paper thick and cream-colored, the crest on the wax unlike anything from around these parts. "For Miss Whitlow," he said simply. She nodded, accepted it, and thanked him in a voice barely above the breeze. The rider touched his brim again and disappeared into the night, hoofbeats fading to nothing. The letter's weight surprised her. Inside the house she lit another lamp, the small flame drawing gentle circles of light across the kitchen table. Her name flowed across the envelope in a hand she did not recognize until memory flickered. The Duke of something. Gray, yes, Alistair Gray. She had been a girl when he'd visited her father's ranch years ago, a friend of a friend who had spoken with a quiet courtesy foreign to the rough men she knew. She slit the wax with the tip of her pocket knife. The words smelled faintly of distant rain. He wrote of the rolling plains that had once startled and enchanted him, of the echoing sky and the unbroken line of grass and wind. He wrote of years gone by, of a restlessness he could not name, and of remembering a young girl who listened more than she spoke. He asked nothing but offered friendship and a promise to visit if ever she wished to see him again. There was a softness to the phrasing, a patient warmth that slipped under her guard. Clara set the letter down, the lamplight trembling against the polished table. A strange stillness filled her chest, half lift, half weight. She thought of the Duke's world across the ocean, of stone halls and clip gardens. Then she thought of her own, of sun-scorched fences and the smell of wet earth after storm. The two seemed impossibly far, yet his words had traveled the distance with ease. A faint whinny carried from the meadow. She stepped outside, letter still in hand. The man by the fire, Evan, she'd heard someone call him at the feed store, rose to tend his horse. Moonlight outlined his lean frame, the brim of his hat catching a silver edge. He moved with quiet certainty, each motion deliberate, a healer's care in the way he checked the animal's hoof. Clara watched without meaning to. He didn't look her way, yet she sensed he knew she was there. The stars sharpened against a deepening sky, their cold brilliance softened by the warmth of the earth. Clara drew a slow breath, the scent of sage settling around her. The letter lay light as a feather in her palm, but the night itself felt heavier, fuller, as though something unseen had shifted. Inside, she placed the envelope in the top drawer of her father's old desk. Her fingers lingered on the worn wood. Perhaps she would answer, perhaps not. For now it was enough to feel the quiet pulse of connection stretching across the world, enough to know that even in this wide, lonesome plain, someone remembered her name. Outside, the coyotes sang their distant hymn, and the gentle wind carried the promise of another day. Morning light spilled across the plain like poured honey, catching in the tall grass and drawing a soft shimmer from every blade. Clara felt the warmth through her boots as she hauled the last of the water buckets to the trough. The boards of the porch still held the night's chill, but the air promised a steady climb toward heat. From the meadow came the muted creak of leather and the slow, patient steps of a horse. She glanced up to see Evan Marlowe riding in, his hat tipped low against the glare, a bundle of tools strapped behind his saddle. He dismounted with an easy grace, the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to be shown. "Morning," he said, voice low as the hum of bees around the sage. Clara nodded, brushing dust from her palms. "Axle snapped on the old wagon," she told him. "Could use another pair of hands if you've got the time." He offered a faint smile, the sort that felt like agreement more than politeness. From his pack he produced a small tin of salve. "Heard you've a calf with a sore leg. Figured I'd bring this along." They set to work without hurry, the sun climbing behind them. The wagon stood lopsided near the barn, one wheel tilted like a tired shoulder. Clara steadied the frame while Evan loosened the bolts, the scent of sunwarmwood rising around them. Metal clinked softly, each sound folded into the broad silence of the plain. They spoke little, weather mostly, the chance of rain come evening, how the sky seemed close enough to touch when night fell clear. Their words were simple but carried the weight of shared hours, each phrase an easy bridge between strangers not quite strangers anymore. When the wheel finally eased free, Evan wiped his brow with the back of his wrist. "A strong grain in this wood," he murmured, running calloused fingers along the axle. Clara watched his hands, steady and sure. She realized she trusted those hands without knowing when that trust had begun. Later, in the shade of the barn, they checked the young calf. The animal blinked wide dark eyes as Evan knelt, murmuring something only the creature needed to hear. He worked the herbal salve gently into the tender joint, the scent of crushed pine and wild mint rising with each motion. Clara crouched beside him, her own hands brushing the calf's coarse fur. Their shoulders nearly touched, and for a moment the world narrowed to the warmth of breath and the quiet rustle of straw. By late afternoon, clouds gathered along the horizon, a slow-moving promise of rain. Clara lit a lantern in the kitchen, its soft glow pooling across the wooden table. She hesitated before retrieving the letter from a drawer. The wax seal lay broken, but the paper still carried a faint fragrance of foreign ink. Evan sat across from her, elbows on the table, his expression open but unreadable. Without quite meaning to, she began to read fragments aloud, the Duke's memories of endless skies, his wistful longing for a freedom he could not name. Her voice sounded different to her own ears, softer, as if the words belonged as much to this place as to the men who'd written them. Evan listened without interruption, eyes steady on hers. When she finished, he let a moment pass before speaking. "How do those words sit with you?" he asked quietly. "Not what do you think, but how do they feel?" She looked down at the letter, surprised by the question's gentleness. "Like wind across the grass," she said after a pause. "Familiar and far in the same breath." Evening deepened, the first metallic hint of rain drifting through the open window. They shared supper at the warm pine table, beans simmered with a little salt pork, cornbread still warm from the oven. The sound of their utensils mingled with the chorus of night insects outside, a music of small things that filled the spaces where conversation might have gone. Neither felt the need to chase the silence. It settled around them like an old quilt, comfortable and true. After the meal, Clara stepped onto the porch. The boards were warm beneath her bare feet, holding the day's heat like a memory. Evan followed, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. They leaned against the rail, watching the sky bruise to a deep indigo. A streak of lightning flickered far off, too distant to hear. Stars began to pierce the dark, each one bright enough to feel almost within reach. Clara found herself speaking of her father, of the years since his passing, of the stubborn hope that kept her tethered to this land. Evan listened, his silence a kind of answer more eloquent than words. When the wind shifted and cool drops began to fall, they lingered instead of retreating. Rain tapped softly on the porch roof, a gentle percussion. Clara's hair darkened in the damp, strands curling against her cheeks. Evan reached out without thinking and brushed a droplet from her sleeve. The brief touch sent a quiet warmth through her that had nothing to do with the coffee. Later, when the storm moved off and the night settled back into stillness, Clara returned to the lantern-lit table. She drew fresh paper toward her and uncapped a bottle of ink. Evan remained by the porch rail, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of receding lightning. Clara bent over the page, her hand steady despite the small tremor of possibility that pulsed through her chest. She wrote slowly, each word deliberate, the scratch of the pen a soft counterpaint to the lingering rain. She did not copy the Duke's elegant turns of phrase. She simply described the land as it truly was tonight, the scent of wet sage, the low hum of crickets, the quiet company of men who healed animals and listened without judgment. As the ink dried, she felt a calm she hadn't known in years, as if the act of writing itself had bridged a distance she could not measure. Outside, Evan's footsteps crossed the porch. He did not knock, only leaned lightly against the doorframe, his presence a quiet reassurance. Clara looked up and met his gaze. Neither spoke. The lantern light flickered between them, steady and warm, while the wide Wyoming night pressed close, infinite and kind. Twilight laid a violet hush over the prairie, the kind of evening that made every sound ring sharper. Clara tightened the corral gate and felt the air shift, a tremor beneath the soft chorus of crickets. From the western rise came the distant thud of hooves, slow and deliberate, a rhythm too measured for a neighbor's casual visit. She straightened, palm pressed to the worn rail as a lone rider emerged against the fading light. The man rode a broad-chested bay, dust haloing each step. A long coat hung loose around his frame, the brim of his hat pulled low. His horse moved stiffly, favoring one leg. He reined a few yards from the porch and let silence speak first. "Evening," he said vinily, voice carrying the rasp of long roads. "Looking for a fellow goes by Evan Rourke. Heard he might be keeping to these hills." Beside her, Evan stilled. He had been walking back from the barn, an easy stride a moment ago, but now his shoulders set in quiet steel. Clara caught the flicker in his jaw, the way his hand brushed the satchel slung across his chest. Not fear exactly, more the reflex of a man who once lived by quick choices. The name the stranger used hung between them like a shot not yet fired. Evan stepped forward, the lantern glow catching the edge of his face. "Your horse is limping," he said, voice even. Left foreleg looked strained. Not a word about the name, not a hint of retreat. The bounty hunter's eyes narrowed. "I'll tend to him once I've found who I'm after." Evan's gaze held steady. "If he's nearby, I'd wager he'd want that horse cared for first. No creature deserves to suffer while men talk." The men hesitated, suspicion flickering with a trace of necessity. He dismounted, the bay shifting uneasily. Clara moved to fetch a bucket of water without waiting to be asked. The bounty hunter watched her, then allowed Evan to kneel beside the animal. Lantern light gilded the healer's hands as he pressed gently along the tendon, murmuring to calm the beast. Clara noticed how his touch never faltered, how his breath stayed easy though the past walked only a heartbeat away. When the horse drank, the stranger finally spoke. "Name's Porter. Been on this trail near a month. I seek Rob Perrell. Killed no one, but folks want him back." His eyes slid toward Evan. Description fits more than a few drifters, though. Tall, quiet, carries himself like someone who once ran with hard company. Evan looked up from the horse, calm as still water. "Hard company teaches a man what he doesn't wish to be," he said. "Sometimes he quits before it's too late." Porter studied him a long beat, the night settling deeper around them. A whippoorwill called from the cottonwoods, the sound lonely and sure. "Maybe," Porter said at last. "Maybe a man can change. Harder thing to prove." He accepted a pouch of oats from Clara, fed the bay, and mounted again. "I'll keep east," he said, almost as if granting a private decision. "If you see that fellow, tell him some debts aren't worth collecting." He tipped his hat and rode into the violet dark, the echo of hooves fading to nothing. Only when the silence returned did Evan straighten, wiping his hands on a rag. He did not look at her at first, eyes fixed on the disappearing rider. Then he turned, the weight of unspoken years in his expression. "My name was Rourke," he said quietly. "Long time ago. I rode with men who believed fast guns solved slow hungers. I left before blood found me, but not before the law put a price on the name. Marlowe is the life I chose after." Clara let the confession settle like dust after a storm. She thought of the Duke's letter folded in her drawer, words of wide horizons and the chance to begin again. Titles, names, distance, they meant little compared to the man who had knelt to heal a stranger's horse instead of hiding from him. "The man I know," she said, "sets bones, not traps. That's the only name I need." Evan's breath eased, though his eyes still held a trace of old sorrow. They walked together to the creek, guiding the bay for one last drink before releasing him to find his master. Stars thickened overhead, a river of cold fire spilling across the black. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of crushed sage beneath their boots. When the horse's shadow melted into the darkness, they lingered by the water's edge. Moonlight skated along the ripples, silvering Evan's profile. Clara felt the quiet thrum of her own heartbeat, the soft scrape of his breath close to hers. He reached for her hand with a hesitance that asked rather than claimed. She met his touch halfway, their fingers finding a slow, sure clasp. The night around them held its breath. Above, constellations burned steady and patient, older than names, older than every story of outlaw and redemption. Clara tightened her hold, not as a promise spoken but as an understanding shared, and in that simple joining the past loosened its grip, leaving only the steady warmth of now.